Welcome to the Spotlight on using motivational interviewing skills to advocate for the positive. My name is Anjali Nandi, and I will be your host as I cover some fundamental motivational interviewing skills that will help you have successful conversations, even about some really tough topics. Over the past 20 years, I have provided treatment services for folks who've been struggling with addiction, as well as those in trouble with the law. I also serve as a consultant to criminal justice organizations, human service entities, and treatment providers. The Center for Health and Safety Culture is an interdisciplinary center serving communities and organizations through research, training, and guidance to cultivate healthy and safe cultures. So let's get to this then. In prevention work, part of our jobs is to provide people with information that doesn't quite fit their beliefs. As human beings, when met with information that challenges us, we challenge it right back. This is normal. Unless we are prepared to receive information with curiosity, we will argue right back with the information. This brief spotlight focuses on how to prepare people for information that might contradict their beliefs. We will talk about how to initiate a conversation. We'll cover some fundamental motivational interviewing skills, and we'll talk about what to do when people argue with the information that we are presenting or push back. And we'll end with how to close a conversation and help them shift out of argument into considering an alternative story to the one that they might believe. In order to do this, it requires us to learn a little bit about our brains. So the first step into entering what could potentially be a challenging conversation is to get ourselves in the right frame. So it all starts with us. And this is where we need to know about our brains, because in our brains, we have neurons that are specifically built to pick up the information of the person that we are talking to. These neurons are called mirror neurons. They are literally neurons that mirror the emotion of the person in front of us. This means that if I enter into a conversation feeling dread or concern or fear, the person I'm speaking with will be influenced by these emotions. So to get myself in the right frame, I remind myself that the goal is to be present in the conversation, to really listen, to be curious, and to inspire curiosity in the person I am talking with. If all I am able to do is to get the person to think, I have done my job. If I get the person to think and also worry a little about the information I'm sharing, get a little concerned maybe, then I have done my job and then some. A technical way of talking about this is that my goal in conversations is to raise doubt and create something called emotional arousal. This just means that it's a little bit of a bother. There's something about the information that they're considering that bothers them a little bit. It's this feeling, this bother, this itch. In motivational interviewing, it's called discrepancy, that really supports change. Unfortunately, sometimes when we enter conversations, we believe that our goal is to convince someone that I'm right and they are wrong. Or perhaps we believe that our goal is to win an argument, and this is furthest from the truth. If we get into a win-lose or a right-wrong frame, not only are we in trouble, but we put the person we're speaking with in a defensive frame. So remember, our goal is to listen, to be curious, and to inspire curiosity in the person that I'm talking with. Unfortunately, in order for a person I'm talking to say out loud that they are concerned about something I'm sharing, or they have some doubts about some of the things that they believe, they need to feel safe enough in the conversation. So it's important for me to create safety throughout the conversation. We create safety in conversations in a couple of different ways. The first is to really listen well. Be interested in their point of view. The second way is to convey understanding and empathy for what they are saying. This means that we stay away from arguing or convincing. Unfortunately, if we argue or try and convince them that we're right, we will only create pushback from them. So think about it this way. Let's say you are a little ambivalent about something. On the one hand, you feel one way. On the other hand, you're kind of doubting it a little bit. And let's say I jump on one side and say, this is the way it is. When I do that, I leave you in the really unfortunate position of having to defend the other side of the argument. When we get stuck in arguments or convincing, we get stuck in content. And we tend to forget that if we get stuck in content, we lose the emotion that's behind whatever somebody's mind frame is. And we end up forcing people to get more entrenched in their views because they're defending that side of the argument. So, in order to create safety, we listen and we convey what we've understood with empathy. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but let's talk about how we begin a conversation, how we initiate a conversation. So we begin the conversation by asking permission to have a conversation about whatever the topic is that we're interested in. This might sound like, I'd love to talk with you about this. Would you be open to it? Once you've received permission, then frame the conversation. We sometimes call this a setup. Doing a good setup means that you've explained the purpose of the conversation and what your expectations are. This might sound something like, I so appreciate your time. I would love to talk with you about underage drinking, and I'm so curious to hear your perspective as well. Sometimes doing a good setup means that you're clear about what this conversation is and isn't about. This conversation isn't about you trying to convince them of something. What this conversation is about is sharing information and challenging them to be open to the information that you're sharing. This conversation is about welcoming their confusion, welcoming their questions, and welcoming their challenge right back at you. Because when they're challenging you, they're engaged in the conversation. So we start the conversation by getting permission, and then we frame the conversation. Once you're ready to engage in providing information, we use a process in motivational interviewing called Elicit, Provide, Elicit. In this framework, you begin by eliciting what this person already knows about the topic. So if the topic is underage drinking, it might sound like, tell me a little bit about what you know already about the risks of underage drinking. So that's the first elicit. You will then provide information that you want to provide, and ideally do it in small chunks. So let's say there's one piece of information that you want to provide, just provide that in a small chunk. If you provide too much information, you lose them. So you provide just a little bit of information, and then you elicit back from them what they've understood or what their thoughts are about the information that you've just shared. It could even be a question about what their reaction is about the information you've shared. This might sound something like, what is your understanding about social host laws? So that's the first elicit. And then you wait for the person to share what they already know. You hear them. You acknowledge what they've said. And then you provide them with a little bit of information that you want to provide. And then you end with the last elicit, which sounds like, how does this information sit with you? Or it could be, tell me a little bit about your thoughts now that I've shared this with you. Another example of using elicit, provide, elicit might be around talking with kids about alcohol or drug use. So the first elicit might sound like, tell me a little bit about your concerns when talking with your children about alcohol and drug use. You listen to them, what they have to say, respond to it, really hear what they're saying, and then provide them a little bit of information, and then do the second elicit, which might sound like, now that I've shared a little bit about some of the risks and benefits of talking with kids about alcohol and drug use, what are your thoughts? Elicit, provide, elicit is such a great skill because we can use it with individuals when having conversations directly with individuals. You can also use elicit, provide, elicit when you're doing a group presentation, for example. The structure is the same, you'd just be eliciting information from the entire group. There are some fundamental skills that will help you carry on a conversation and maintain safety throughout the conversation and help keep the person engaged with you. In motivational interviewing, these basic skills are called open questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. Open questions are questions that seek a broad amount of information. They usually start with things like what, how, tell me about, describe, explain, or share with me. You might be wondering, why do we do open questions? Open questions allow people to share their side of the story. It's a way of gathering information that doesn't limit the information that they share with you. Interestingly enough, open questions reduce their defensiveness because you're getting curious about them. And because it reduces defensiveness, it increases safety. In contrast to open questions, we have something called closed questions. Closed questions limit the information that the person gets to share. So a closed question might sound something like, do you know how frequently kids drink and drive? So that is a yes or no question. And unfortunately, it limits the sharing that you get from people. As opposed to an open question, which may sound like, what do you already know about how frequently kids drink and drive? So open questions invite a conversation in a very helpful way to get the other person's point of view. So let's talk about affirmations then. Affirmations are statements of understanding or statements of praise. They even might be a statement of recognition of a struggle. We use affirmations because they greatly reduce defensiveness and they create a partnership. They help the other person feel seen and therefore increase safety in the conversation. Affirmations might sound something like, I really appreciate your willingness to engage in this conversation with me. Or it might be, thank you for sharing that with me. Or, it sounds like you're really engaged in your community already. Any of those are affirmations, and what they're doing is either providing praise or recognition, or even recognizing something that might be going on that is a struggle. So those are affirmations, and the next skill that we talk about in motivational interviewing is reflections. And reflections are really at the heart of motivational interviewing. They are such a powerful skill. Because what reflections do is they convey understanding and empathy. And when you're experiencing empathy and conveying empathy to the other person, the really interesting thing is the other person's neurons are picking up that empathy, and it increases the likelihood that they will treat you in the same way. Meaning, if you show that you're really open to their information, it increases the likelihood that they will be open to your information. Reflections also create insight. They allow for some discrepancy to build, and they support the relationship. Reflections are stating back to the person what you have understood in a way that deepens their own understanding about what was shared. So reflections are not just about parroting back to the person what you've heard. It goes so much beyond that. Reflections state what's not being said, but what you are picking up. Oftentimes, reflections might start with certain things called stems. You don't really have to use these stems, but sometimes they're helpful. Stems for reflection sound like things like what I'm hearing is, or sounds like, or it's as if you're saying, you're thinking, and then you complete it with whatever you've understood from them. So let's do a few examples. Let's say a person says, I don't really see a problem with this. Your reflection might be, it sounds like you're a little surprised by this information. If the person says, I don't think this information really applies to my community, your reflection might be, it's kind of hard to see how your community might fit into the information that I'm sharing with you. So all reflections are statements of empathy. They're stating back what we've heard. We're not arguing. We're not defending our position. We're just really hearing them. The last skill is a summary. Summaries are putting together information that you've heard throughout the conversation. It sort of puts everything together in a bouquet and hands this back to the person that you're talking with. It can sometimes be used to bring closure to a conversation. Sometimes summaries are used to transition from one area of a conversation to the next. Summaries are very helpful for those two reasons, sort of putting things together, staying in one place, or moving forward. You might use a summary that sounds like, let me see if I can summarize what we've talked about so far. We talked a little bit about your thoughts about underage drinking, and then we moved on to talking about social host laws. And then you shared some concerns about the information I'm providing and wanted more details about it. Did I capture that accurately? So that's one example of a summary. So the other piece in motivational interviewing is to really understand something called ambivalence. One of the things that you'll be tracking during the conversation is the level of ambivalence in the other person. Ambivalence is feeling two ways about something. On the one hand, they might want to, on the other hand, they don't. Maybe they want to engage with you, but then maybe they don't. You'll notice this back and forth, and ambivalence is extremely normal and very powerful, and is actually a step towards change. So whenever I hear ambivalence, I get really excited. Get curious about it. Find out more. Ambivalence might sound something like, let's say you're having a conversation with a parent about talking with their kids about drugs and alcohol, and the parent might say something like, well, I really want to have a conversation with my kid, but I'm worried that if I do, it might put things in their brain that weren't there in the first place, and now I've made the situation worse. So you might do a lovely reflection and pick up on this ambivalence. The reflection might sound like, gosh, on the one hand, you really want to engage your kids in a conversation about alcohol and drugs that's really depthful. And on the other hand, you're worried about what might happen because you're doing it. You could potentially follow up with a question. The question might sound like, tell me a little more about why you want to talk with your kids about drugs and alcohol. And let's say they provide some information about that. You can reflect that. Reflect whatever you've understood from them. You can do a question that goes the other way. Tell me about what you're worried about when talking with your kids about drugs and alcohol. And that way, what you're doing is helping them sort through their own ambivalence. So the real caution when you hear ambivalence, I really want to talk with my kids, but then again, I don't. Be very careful about jumping on one side and saying, oh gosh, you really must talk with your kids. Don't you know the research that says you should? It'll make things better. Be very, very careful about not doing that. Because if you jump on one side of the ambivalence, you force them into the other side. So instead, when you hear ambivalence, either ask about both sides, reflect both sides, even affirm their willingness to be vulnerable and to share with you that they feel ambivalent. So when you hear ambivalence, again, really explore it and get curious about it. That way, you help them sort through their own ambivalence, and you help them come up with some conclusions about their next steps. So a few more tips to stay in the conversation and keep the person engaged is to maintain safety throughout the conversation. Make sure the person knows that you're not there to attack them or their worldviews, but to really engage them in a conversation because you're curious about them. Anytime their safety is disrupted, you'll notice them getting defensive or pushing back. This is really important because they're giving you a clear signal that you need to step out of the content and reestablish safety. That might mean saying what this conversation is and isn't about. It could also mean just apologizing, which might sound something like, I seem to have upset you, I'm sorry about that. Or you could say something like, I may have pushed this conversation in a direction that you didn't want to go, and I apologize for that. Maybe it's saying something like, I'm worried that you're beginning to feel that this conversation is about me convincing you about something, and that's not it at all. I'm sorry if I've given you that impression. Another tip is to really stay curious. Stay curious about their point of view. Engage their point of view. Ask questions and try to understand where they are coming from. The more the person experiences you trying to understand them, the more they're willing to understand you because of mirror neurons. When you convey understanding and empathy, it triggers understanding and empathy in them. Pushback in a conversation will come in many forms. Let's talk about managing some of the common ones. The first type of pushback could be about the relationship, and we call this person-based resistance, meaning they're pushing back against you. This might sound something like them saying, "You're wrong," or "You don't know what you're talking about," or "Those stats are all incorrect," something along those lines. The second type of pushback is about the issue. It's sometimes called issue-based resistance, which sounds something like, "Yes, but that information doesn't apply to me." Or it might be some passiveness or hopelessness, which might sound something like, "Yes, it's a really big problem. There's nothing we can do about it." So any type of pushback is extremely normal. And it's up to us to respond to it. Not to take it head on and argue, but to recognize the message that's underneath. The skill of reflections can really come in handy to get beyond somebody's pushback. So if a person is pushing back and saying something like, "You're wrong," or "You don't know what you're talking about," then it's really important to reflect back something like, "Yeah, this information doesn't quite fit you. Help me understand where you're coming from." Or help me understand what makes sense to you. And what you're doing there is you're providing a reflection and then a question, which really hands the autonomy back to the other person. You're really respecting where they're coming from, and that disarms resistance and disarms pushback. This is true about issue-based resistance as well. If the person says, "Well, that doesn't apply to my community," your reflection might be, "It's really hard to see how this information might fit you." And then see what they say. You could follow up with, "Help me understand which of this information does and doesn't apply." If the person is coming from a place of hopelessness or being passive, you might say something like, "It feels like there's no hope here and you don't feel like you can do much about it." Or you might say something like, "This feels really daunting." And they might agree with you. And your next step might be a question. So if you were to imagine some of the interventions we could do, or if there were some ways of solving this problem, what are some ideas you might have? This means that you're staying upbeat but respectful throughout. You're really not taking their bait. You're not agreeing with them that, yes, the situation is hopeless. But you're getting curious about what the possibilities might be. Close the conversation by asking the person to summarize what was talked about, or by summarizing for them what you've discussed. Include in your summaries any surprises, any new information or ideas that were generated during the conversation. Capitalize on any shifts that were made during the conversation. For example, if the person started by holding on really tightly to the fact that this problem doesn't exist in their community, and maybe during the conversation shifted away from that, comment about that. It might sound like, "I so appreciate your willingness to engage in the conversation. I know that when we started, you weren't really sure if this applied to you or your community, and yet you were so willing to consider that some of this information might just apply." So in your summary, say something about how you noticed they shifted off of the position that they took. In your closing of the conversation, summarize the next steps. This might include a conversation of them around what they see the next steps are, but make sure there is something about the next steps involved in closing the conversation. And then always see at the end if there are any resources the person needs, or any resources you can share with them, so that they know where to take this information next, or they know where they can look for additional information to support whatever they are curious about. Closing the conversation is important because it helps the person know what to do next. It leaves them feeling like they have some agency. So let's summarize this spotlight on motivational interviewing. We began this spotlight by talking about what can help us get in the right frame. We talked about mirror neurons, and we talked about the goals of the conversation and how to stay curious and really support safety. We then moved into how to initiate a good conversation, asking for permission, doing a good setup. And then we talked about a particular process in motivational interviewing called Elicit, Provide, Elicit. And then we covered some fundamental and really important motivational interviewing skills: open questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. We talked a little bit about ambivalence, and then we dove into what to do when things get difficult and when things get tough in conversations. We talked about how to manage pushback or resistance. And we then summarized by closing the conversation and how to bring the conversation back around by summarizing what we've talked about, any surprises or shifts, and next steps. If you would like to learn more, here are some additional resources that might be helpful for you. Feel free to follow us on social media or join our email list for announcements about upcoming events and our newsletter. Thank you for joining me on this spotlight focused on motivational interviewing and using motivational interviewing to have some tough conversations and yet do so in really helpful ways.